I'm delighted that all of you are here. Many of you I know already, and welcome. There's a changing of the guard of sorts going on. As you've heard, the complexity program is mutating maybe into a complexity institute, and we've heard quite a bit about that this morning. What we thought we would do at this stage is to talk a little bit about where this complexity program came from. It's been so ably run by Jan Vasbinder, and how that has led to a complexity institute, and what we're hoping at NTU to get out from this new complexity institute. What's the vision and the direction that will be taken? So this particular session was cooked up largely by Jan Vasbinder and myself in a small hotel lobby near San Francisco airport about a month ago. And we were talking about having a session that would introduce the new institute, and Jan's idea I thought was a really good one, say, where did all this come from? Who's to blame in a sense, and where do some of the threads come from that led to this in Singapore? As we were talking, Jan said, well, I had talked to so-and-so in 2007 and talked to somebody in 1984, and I said, well, I talked to people, and doubtless John Holland and Professor Su Guaning, who's here, we'd all talked to various people, we'd interacted. We realized there were a lot of threads. And then Jan said to me out of the blue, he said, do you realize that what we're really talking about here, where the institute came from, is hidden connections? So this was Jan's sort of funny idea, but I think the more and more I thought about that, the more I thought this is true. So what we want to talk about this morning is some of the hidden connections that led to complexity here at NTU, what we hope to get from it in the future, and where all this is going in Asia. We're lucky to have a panel here. You've, all of you know, I believe by now, Jan Vasbinder. As many people are going to say this morning, a lot of the threads lead back to Jan and an institute that he set up called Institute Paralimes in Europe, and you'll hear more about that. Jan has very, very ably led the complexity efforts here for the last 3 years, and it's due to those efforts that we have a complexity institute this morning to launch. We also have Professor Su, if I may call him by his first name, Guaning, has a long and distinguished career here in Singapore. Most of you know that he's been president here, president of NTU, for 5 years, if I recall, or more, and has brought NTU, if I may say so, from being a rather not well-known university when he took it over to being a world-class university when he stepped down here as president. Turns out that more than anyone here on the stage talking about hidden connections, I believe Professor Su has had an awful lot to do with setting up complexity here at NTU. We also are lucky enough to have John Holland. John, as you heard, has just celebrated his 85th birthday, and I'm absolutely thrilled John is here. All roads in complexity lead back to Ann Arbor and to John Holland. You can't really say anyone started complexity science, but I wouldn't even say arguably, undeniably, more than anyone else, complexity has been fathered by John Holland, and we have the man here himself. Most of you know me already. My name is Brian Arthur. Among other things, I fell in with bad company in Santa Fe in 1987, or I got waylaid, I think, by John Holland and others. So I've been associated with the Santa Fe Institute since for the last 27 years, if I've done the math right, and have served on its science board for about 20 years, its board of trustees and many other capacities. So I'm also steeped in complexity. For the last 5 years, I've been coming back and forth to NTU, working for the president's office, and behind the scenes largely to get complexity set up here at NTU. So we're having a panel discussion. I will restrict people to talking for about 4 minutes each, and we'll have a couple of go-rounds of this. But the whole idea here is to get some history of how all this came about in NTU and what we're hoping to do. And later you'll be hearing from the two new directors. I'll ask Jan to introduce them properly towards the end. So without further ado, why don't we start with, if you would start, John, and just say a few words on how you got involved with this and some of your own history. By the way, you know, all of this is arbitrary where it started, but if we're drinking beer at night, I try to get John Holland started about what he was doing at MIT in 1950, or was it 1850, John? I don't know, but let's start off with you. Thank you.
I see. Oh, good. Well, I'll give a hidden connection. It was about 1986, I think, and I was spending a year as a fellow at the Los Alamos Laboratory. And as one of my duties, I guess, I was supposed to give a laboratory-wide talk. And at the end of that talk, there was this very handsome guy with curly white hair sitting down in the audience asking me questions. And I have a tendency to answer questions with a smile or something like that. But he kept asking the questions. And at the end of the question period, I think it was Doan Farmer came up to me and did you know who that was? And no, I had no idea. Well, it turned out to be Murray Gelmont. And Murray somehow must have accepted my approach, because it was because of Murray that I got involved in the preliminary meetings for the Santa Fe Institute and was ultimately included in the formation of that institute. So talk about hidden connections, there's one.
Oh, you can go a bit further, John, please.
We haven't used that before.
Okay, well, okay, let's hand over to Jan at this stage. By the way, we're not going to do this perfectly chronologically, you know. John met Murray, Jan met John, and so on. But we're trying to get different paths that led to what's happening here in Singapore. Thanks very much, John.
Okay. Well, I'll start in 1984. In 1984, I attended a conference in Stanford on artificial intelligence. And there was Professor John Holland, who gave a talk about genetic algorithms. And I did not understand a word. So after the conference, I approached Professor Holland and said, I'm Jan, and I'm from Holland. Yeah, and I didn't understand a word. And then he invited me, that started an instant friendship, and he invited me to come to Ann Arbor to get a full explanation of genetic algorithms, which eventually I did, and we established a friendship that is lasting until today. And John has since become the key person in the whole development of my interest in interdisciplinary science and in complexity in the end. At one point, when we started the thinking about a Santa Fe-like institute in Europe, which we didn't have a name for yet. It turned out to be Institut Paralimes. I was very much at loss of how to proceed, because everybody that I talked to had told me you need some Nobel laureates to start this. Now, how do you find a Nobel laureate if you're not even a scientist? So I asked John, and John said, "Oh, I have a good friend, and his name is Manfred Eigen, and I'll ask Manfred Eigen, and then we'll come back to you." So about 2 weeks later, John said, "You can call Manfred Eigen. Manfred Eigen is very willing to help you." And so I called Manfred Eigen, and Manfred Eigen had in the meantime prepared a list of 15 people, among whom was Bertel Anderson, but among whom were also a few other Nobel laureates that I could call, because he had already called them. And so that's what happened. I called them, and all of them said yes, except for one who said he didn't have time, but that didn't really matter anymore, because we had 15 real good founding fathers for the Institute. And then John played a role again in the subsequent activities. We founded the Institute in 2004. John was there at the founding conference. Just 2 or 3 days before that founding conference started, I got a call. "My name is Brian Arthur. I hear you are setting up a Santa Fe-like institute in Europe. I want to be involved." So Brian became involved. Actually, he played a key role in that whole setup in this castle in Holland. He gave a very inspiring and very exciting speech during dinner, totally improvised, because he wasn't asked before. And so the ball started rolling, and the institute eventually got launched. We had first a science meeting in Strasbourg, if I remember correctly, hosted by Bertel Anderson. And then you already suspect what the ties are, because it was because of Bertel that I came here in the end. We had the meeting in Strasbourg. We set up the institute, and then afterwards we had another meeting with Brian, who became member of what I would call the kitchen cabinet, that wrote the manual for setting up such institutes. And although you wouldn't notice it, but a lot of things that happened in the complexity program are largely based on this manual that Brian and I wrote in, I think it was some 2005 or 6 or 7 or so. So I can go on much more, but I think maybe this is a good...
A little more, if you would.
A little more. Okay, then I should actually say one thing. The first conference of the first workshop of Institut Paralimes was on conceptual neuroscience. And in that conference I met John Holland was there. I met Iriki Atsushi, who was at that time a professor at Riken. He's still a professor at Riken, but he is now also a visiting professor at NTU, and one who's taking a lot of initiatives to do very exciting things. A few months after that conference, we have the first big conference in Holland called, we mentioned it, Science Without Boundaries. Of course, John was there, Brian was there. Bertel, unfortunately, could not be there. But I'm not sure whether you were there, Martin, but the Sidney Brenner was there. We had a great conference. That conference was initiated by, in a strange way, or in an interesting way, by Helena Hongao. I don't know whether she's in the audience. But a couple of years before that, or 2 years before that, Helena and I met here in Singapore by accident. Not entirely by accident, because John had told me that I should meet her. And Helena knew that John would be 80 years old shortly. So then the Santa Fe Institute and Institut Paralimes decided to set up a conference in honor of John in 1980, in 2009, hosted by NTU. And that's when we got Guaning involved, I think, but that's something that Guaning may be able better to tell than I can. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, two threads I'd like to talk about. One is Peter may have something to add to this, but how did I get some exposure to Santa Fe? Actually, it was, I guess you go back all the way to the Manhattan Project, where you spin off Los Alamos, which is doing nuclear weapons, Sandia Laboratories, which is doing quite a number of the firing mechanisms and the non-nuclear stuff and nuclear bombs. And Santa Fe is, in a way, related in some ways because of the luminaries who started it. The thread there was that I used to work for Peter, and he's a very interesting boss to work for. I was trying to find the right word. I mean, he lets you do all kinds of things. He's always had his eye on the strategic things, but you have a lot of leeway with Peter. And one of the things we were doing was to explore collaboration with the U.S. Defense Department. And so I remember there was a trip undertaken in the 90s, led by the chief defense scientist, who went to explore the various laboratories in the U.S. And in a meeting that we were talking about where to go, I suggested Sandia because I knew Sandia was doing some great things. It's not very well publicized a lot, but and also I don't think we wanted to suggest to go to Los Alamos in case somebody thinks we're trying to start building nuclear weapons. So it got onto the itinerary, and we were so impressed with Sandia that later on, when Peter had his meetings in Washington with the Defense Department Undersecretary, he also visited Sandia, and we developed a friendship with Sandia. And Santa Fe being also in New Mexico, and also something that is developing something unusual, it sort of got on slightly on the radar horizon or close to the radar horizon, not very obvious. That's one thread. The other thread is very much Bertil Anderson. Actually, the story about how Bertil Anderson came to NTU is actually quite interesting. He was not on the radar horizon either. We were looking for a provost as part of the autonomous university framework that we were building up in NTU in 2006, when the government asked us to do this, to set it up as a company and to try to adopt the best practices of the private universities in the US, which are some of the best in the world. And in so doing, we wanted a provost who is able to raise the research standards of our faculty, and in so doing, raise the standing and reputation of the university throughout the world. Bertil was then the chief executive of the European Science Foundation. And as things turn out, one of the Singaporeans who were recruited back to Singapore as part of the drive in National Science and Technology Board to build science and technology in Singapore, Chua Nam Hai, knew Bertil Anderson. They're kind of in similar fields. And he was recommended as a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the National Science Foundation, National Research Foundation in Singapore, which was set up in 2006 at the same time as going autonomous. So he became a member of the visiting delegation of the scientific advisors to NTU on one of their visits, one of their meetings. And on that meeting, by that time we had done a few things on research in NTU. So we had some very bright young research students, including the undergraduates, as well as some of the fresh PhD students. So when they came to visit, we decided to show them the young people's work, as opposed to having the professors interact with them. At the same time, we brought it to their hotel so that they won't be so tired, because it was at the end of the day, and we're hosting the dinner after that. And Bertil told me afterwards that was sometime later, that he was so impressed with the young people who talked to him about the research that he got interested in NTU. And then one of our senior staff, Anthony Teo, happened to sit next to Bertil at the dinner. So he told Bertil that we're looking for a provost, would you be interested? Bertil being Bertil, he didn't really say anything. He kind of non-committal. But when I heard about it, I thought what a perfect fit Bertil would be for the role that we had in mind for the provost. So since he didn't say no, you never take no for an answer, but especially when he didn't say no, we pursued him. So we started looking at how to persuade him to come to NTU, and I think one of the pivotal moment was when I had a 2 to 3 hour meeting at Geneva Airport with him. I happened to be in Switzerland, in Zurich, and he was in Geneva trying to raise funds for the European Science Foundation. So we arranged to meet at the airport. I took the train there, and we talked about all the various issues, including the people he would like to bring, what kind of ambitions he has, and what sort of positioning he should have in the university. I mean, I always felt he needs to be somewhat more than a provost. So we agree on how we're going to handle things, and so that's still the deal. And what happened with the Santa Fe and the equivalent of Santa Fe in the Europe later on was very much because of Bertil. He came to me in 2009, or actually it was before that. I guess it was not long after he came in as provost, and he talked about Santa Fe and the Institute Paralimes in Europe. And at that time, I think Jan can provide more details. There were some issues with the funding for Institute Paralimes, because I don't know whether it's because of Jan being from Holland and John being named Holland. Holland was funding the Institute Paralimes. But it was a limited amount of funding, and I think it was running out. And so Bertil came to me and asked whether we can use our budget to somehow support Institute Paralimes. Now, this being a Singapore government budget, is a little bit tough to do that, but I told him we can do something in this way. We can organize some events together in Institute Paralimes. Institute Paralimes would help us to bring in the prominent speakers, because they have all the connections, and we can provide the budget for the conferences. So in that way, Institute Paralimes is still operating together with NTU. I also at that time thought that was a good entry point to try to develop this interdisciplinary area for NTU. So Bertil agreed, and we started talking with Jan, and you already heard from him about the conference that he was talking about for John Holland's 80th birthday, and so that turned out to be the first conference. I must say, on a very personal level, that conference was a real eye-opener for me, because previously I just hear about things, but at that conference you hear from the people who are doing things in this area, and it was so illuminating and eye-opening, and you suddenly feel that the horizons are widened, and you can see things at a higher level, and things can be tackled, which previously you feel it seems to be very difficult to tackle. So that one thing led to another, and I think Jan eventually now having more conferences, and we're having developed it further. I think the team that took over after I stepped down as president, including Freddie, of course, is so supportive that I'm very, very glad he has reached this level today. And I'm trying to play a part in this. I think at least I saw one of my students here. I'm doing something which relates to complexity, and I suggested they come to this conference. So I hope more of them will come.
Very good. Let me give a bit of my own story. I want to tell one or two things about the Santa Fe Institute, because it also had to start somewhere. the way I got involved in this was I was sort of innocently wandering across the quad at Stanford, and the economist Kenneth Arrow stopped me. This was 1987. He said, we're having a conference in the Rockies. It's in a little town in New Mexico, Santa Fe. It's in September, would you come? And so I said, of course I'll come. Then I said, where's Santa Fe? And then I said, what's the conference on, Ken? He explained there was going to be 10 physicists and 10 economists and theoreticians, and they would talk to each other. I said, I'd love to come. When I got to Santa Fe, this was in August 1987, I discovered I was sharing a house with a man who told me his name was John Holland, not Jan from Holland, but John Holland. And we chatted a lot, and we drank an awful lot of beer in the evenings and talked about his view of things, which I found fascinating and completely unfamiliar. And I thought it was great companion late night talking about chess as a metaphor for all of life and for game theory and so on. I remember going to Ginger Richardson, who was running the Santa Fe Institute pretty well single-handedly at the time. There were about 7 people at the Institute then. And I had some query, and I said, what's your policy on such and such? And she said, well, I don't know. So I said, well, what do you usually do for visiting fellows? She said, well, I don't know. I said, why not? She said, well, you and John Holland are the first visiting fellows. So I realized it was kind of then I realized, oh my God, this thing really is a startup. It was, 3 people and a dog, or 7 people and a few dogs and cats. We were the dogs and cats. I want to say a couple of words. Santa Fe didn't start off the Institute. I know it did. There was a thunderbolt from Zeus here that kind of started things. But Santa Fe was very unsure of itself when it started. It was largely the creation of a few people, David Pines, Murray Gell-Mann, John Holland here, and a few others, and especially George Cowan. We had that meeting in 1987. John was there as one of the physicists. Stu Kaufman, who was a theoretical biologist, was an honorary physicist for that week. We had David Ruel, who was a mathematician. They made him a physicist too. The economists included Larry Summers and a few other notables. But it was the most amazing atmosphere. And I remember the first afternoon, it's a story I was telling a few people last week, but it's worth telling again. My housemate, John Holland, stood up to give a talk in the afternoon. And John went on and on about classifier systems and genetic algorithms and AI, artificial intelligence and machine learning. And I'm sitting there thinking, what on earth does this have to do with economics or the economy as an evolving complex system, which was the excuse for the conference? And then it dawned on me that John was actually talking about teaching systems to get smart. And John was showing us algorithms by which rather simple systems such as E. coli, bacteria, would do interesting things in response to their environment. Then he started to codify that into computer algorithms. And I was sitting there thinking, oh my God, John is teaching all of us how to design systems with minimal cognition who could get smart. And I thought, that's really the economy. You might be very intelligent here in the audience, but most of us try to muddle through in the economy. We respond to our environment, and over time we cognize, we try to figure out what situation we're in, and we get smarter. And so I sat there, and it was as if the Holy Ghost or something had come down. I was sitting there in awe, thinking, oh my God, John Holland is the answer. Pardon me, John. All we need to do is figure out what the question is. So, and I had him all to myself in the evenings, so I went and bought a lot more beer, paid a lot more attention to John. The other person I want to mention is George Cowan. I was brought back, we were asked, John and myself, to come back a year later, an academic year later, and run a program at the Santa Fe Institute on the economy as an evolving complex system. I said, well, how does that fit with the other programs? I was told there aren't any other programs. This is the first program, first research program at the Santa Fe Institute. I called John. John said, sorry, he wasn't available. So suddenly I was running the first research at the Santa Fe Institute. I reported to George Cowan, who was president of the Santa Fe Institute. We had only 1 or 2 layers of hierarchy at the whole institute. George was wonderful to work for, but he wasn't easy to work for. I would go in and say, George, I have 5 things to tell you, 4 of them are very good, so I'd recount the 4 things, got a big research grant, we did this, we did that. John would say, what's the 5th one? I said, well, it's not so good, George, this or that. George would look gloomy and horrible, and then somehow the rest of my day was spent trying to sort of figure out how to cheer George up again. Years and years later, this is about 2 or 3 years ago, George had turned 90. There was a dinner in Santa Fe. I passed his table, and George beckoned me over, and he said, this is Brian, he was saying to his friends. Brian ran the first research at Santa Fe under me, and you know, you remember all that, Brian. Some of George's friends who were similarly 90-ish said, piped up, you know, what was George like to work for? And I said very truthfully, George Cowan was the best boss I ever had in my life. And then there was a pause and everybody stared at me and I said, he was also the most difficult boss I ever had in my life. George looked at me, he says, I wasn't difficult, he says. I was a son of a bitch. So I said, George, where did you get that style from? Note this, everybody who's running institutes. He said, and this kind of gave me a shudder, he said, I got it from General Groves, who had directed the atomic bomb project in Los Alamos. George had been brought there at age 19 by Fermi. George came to Los Alamos because he knew how to cut graphite. Nobody else knew that in the US. George used to sit and regale me with stories about this person, that person, the other person at Los Alamos. He would always say, you know something, they're all dead. They all died of cancer. By rights, I should be dead too, he said. I've been radiated far more than any of them, but maybe it's keeping me alive. So I want to tip a hat to George Cowan. The last thing I will say about that is, and I think this is a carryover to this new institute getting going and what Jan has been running for the last 3-4 years here, is that it's very important to have weird science. I used to think what we do at Santa Fe, is it real science? Yes, it was real science. But I always thought it was cool science. We had no disciplines. And the wags at Santa Fe said, well, there's no disciplines, but there's no discipline either. We had no departments, we had no students. This is a professor's dream. If you're students, you didn't hear that. We had no students. There was no tenure system. There were no levels. Everybody was a professor. And somebody would knock your door at 11 a.m. in the morning and say, we want to get together and talk about how to do economics without equilibrium. And say, is that possible, you know, to do economics? I don't know, let's go and talk about it. And so a huge amount of creative stuff came out of that. I was taken aside by a journalist halfway through this. His name is Jim Glick, or James Glick. He wrote this book called Chaos. And he was kind of curious. We weren't doing chaos, we were doing complexity. And Jim interviewed me and he said, how would you describe your group? And I thought and thought and thought. And you know, I had John Holland, I had Ken Arrow, I had a bunch of Nobel Prize winners, I had incredible luminaries, I had people who had sort of wandered in off the street, I had probability theorists from Russia, it was incredible. Don Farmer would come and go, and we'd others, Chris Langton, Stuart Kaufman, and it was just amazing. And so Glick was saying, describe your group, please. And I said, I don't know. No, describe this group. And I said, look, I can't. And he said, would you kindly describe your group? What's a metaphor for them? And I said, Jim, do you remember the bar at the end of the universe in Star Wars? With all those weird, I don't know if you remember this, is the bar in Star Wars with all the weird creatures. Jabba the Hutt, Chewie back of the creatures that sort of couldn't quite articulate but went, that was the Santa Fe Institute. In its earliest conception, we didn't know if we'd be alive in 3 months' time, and I later discovered it was being kept alive largely by George Cowan's money and by John Holland's inspiration. Years later, I met Jan, and as I say, Jan and I sat down literally at Jan's kitchen table, being plied with coffees and cups of tea, trying to figure if we could get something like that started in Europe. Jan should talk more about this. It's very much Jan who has set up the linkage with NTU, and as Guaning has just described, that led to much more. So I want to go round again, and Jan, if I could get you started again on how IPL led into this work at NTU, and what you have to say about the last 3 or 4 years with the program here.
Okay. Well, let me start with the little note that Guaning made on how IPL ran out of money. It's not an example to give because there's not a story to tell because it sheds a very bad light on the Dutch governance system. But we had the whole thing set up pretty well. We had money from the government, and based on that money, we had money from large foundations, and based on that, we had money from a number of companies. And then, without any reason ever given to us, the government pulled out the plug, and then the funds, of course, didn't come through from the foundations, and then the industries said, well, if there's no money from these foundations and not from the government, then we are not going to support it either. So all of a sudden, and that was around 2008, which was precisely the best time to find new funds. So we sort of were lost. We still had some money to do some things, but it ran out very quickly too. Then there was a decision made by a few people. I was one of them. Bertel Anderson was one of them. Not to let the whole thing die, even though it didn't look as if it was going to go anywhere. And Bertel at that time already was in Singapore, so he obviously got the support from Guaning not to let the whole thing die, and we have been able to keep it alive until today. Although the only thing alive about it is the fact that there's still a few people alive that set it up. There's not much going on. But there is a promise that there is the expectation that actually we will find a new host in Europe, and that in the course of the coming year and a half or so we'll be able to set it up properly. Now, the connection with Bertel was a key for me coming to Singapore. Actually, we should say that at the end of the conference, in honor of John, a very important person entered the field, and that was Monique van Donsel. Monique van Donsel was Dutch, of course, because somebody mentioned that this is a Dutch conspiracy. So the Monique van Donsel was attracted by Bertel and worked very much, very quickly became the director of the president's office. So it worked directly for Guaning. And together, the two or three of them managed to initiate, and then later Brian came in to help give substance to that, to initiate the enthusiasm within NTU for something which at that time was still called an Institute for Interdisciplinary Science. I don't think complexity really was the running word at the time. And Monique, in the name of, this is representing Institut Paralime Santa Fe, and NTU organized a conference in Tokyo, and then organized a number of workshops at NTU, and finally, I think it was in March 2011, organized the workshop that got the last workshop on interdisciplinary science. That was more or less the starting point of the complexity program. And it's not because of, but at that time I just happened to be here, and I think that's the way it worked. And then Brian approached me and said, would you be willing to consider the possibility of becoming the director of such a program? And so, since this was a serious question, I had to think about it seriously. So I said yes, and then Guaning invited me to his office and said, now that we should also make some other arrangements so that you can come. And that actually started me being here in July. Monique had at that time already gone. So we had to start, and Monique and Bertel had prepared the grounds in the sense that identified some really talented people at NTU, which became later the core of the complexity community. And they had managed to create support at the government level or the agencies level they've discussed there. And so when I came in July, actually there was very little I needed to do. I just needed to continue where Brian left off. And that's what we did. We established the community a little further, not a little further, actually it grew quite a bit. We managed to and I should say, and when I say we, I really mean we, because there's two people, apart from all the others, that were key to developing this. Is Suan, who's sitting at the corner, who doesn't like to be recognized, but I think we should. And Karen, who was my secretary, who together, without them, nothing of this would have happened, even though the starting point was perfect. So we set up the community. The community grew. We involved people from NTU and from NUS and SUTD in it. SMU, sorry, yeah, SMU is and there's some of them in the audience here. That was one of the first things. With that group, we tried to find out what really the interests were of the scientists and what kind of themes we might tackle in the future. Because it was clear that at that time there were no real funds to do research, but it was really the point was to get the fire to the point where we could start to do research. So I identified 6 themes. A few of them probably will be picked up by the new directors. And in the end, the directors will decide their own themes. But the interest of the group was around 6 themes, and it turned out that much of that was also the interest of the Singaporean government, so the agencies. That was one thing we did. Another thing we did is to create visibility, and I don't know who advised me to do this, but it turned out to be a great idea to invite, to develop conferences like this, to invite to organize workshops with the, maybe it's putting it a little wrongly, but with a clear intent to show to the world that very good people were willing to come to Singapore to talk about very interesting issues. So we did More is Different, crude look at the whole, and now this one. And I can tell you we have the one for next year already in our mind, so that's, which will be, I'll tell you that in the last day. So the conferences became a key issue, and that also an important part of our organizational efforts. Another thing that became very important is to establish contacts with different agencies in the world, different institutes in the world. So Santa Fe was already there through all the connections that we had mentioned before, but there was also an Arbor, which at that time was only John as a connection, but since then we've broadened that quite a bit. There was George Mason University with Robert Axelrod, and who was a speaker a few years ago. There was Arizona State University with Sander van der Leeuw, and actually we met Steve Lansing already at the conference for John. That was his first time he came in, and so the getting all those different institutes in the United States mainly, and a few in Europe, interested in Singapore became very important in getting being able to attract the people to Singapore for such conferences. And now, and in the last instance, now we have Steve and Peter Sloot here, who also were sort of extracted from this network. And so that was, I think, the second or the third thing we did. And of course, with one of the key things which happened to be, I think, worked out very well is we developed a relationship with the different agencies in Singapore. And there's a growing interest now from the different agencies to actually define problems that might be useful and might be interesting for the Complexity Institute now to address.
Guaning, would you be kind enough to say a couple more words? We're running a little shorter of time, but just take it from your perspective, and Bertil's, if you would, as to how this finally the last few years has gelled into what it is.
Okay. Thank you very much, Brian. Actually, it would have been great to have Bertil here, except that he had to travel, so he isn't here. But he has been actually the key person in NTU who has brought this up. I basically supported him in this process, and I guess later on Freddie as well, and various other people. But I think one person I think I have to mention is Brian and his role. Actually, Brian came to us through a slightly different hidden connection as well, which is a little bit of a Stanford connection, a little bit of an economics and business school connection, because the previous business school dean invited him to visit for a period. Now, of course, he is known as a complexity and Santa Fe luminary, so we talked a lot about the complexity while he was here. And in the drive to get complexity started here, we are quite clear that it would not work if the president and provost just pronounced to everybody, say, you guys have to get involved in complexity, do something. You know what happens with academics. If you do that, they'll all turn away from it. So we have to build it from the bottom up. And I still remember talking with Brian about lighting the fire. I said he's the fire starter. He knows all the great things that have been done in this field. And if he can talk to the young people and get them excited about the whole thing, then we have a sustainable fire here. And I think some of the key young people are here. Let me see, Lok Yu is over there. Is Siu-An here? Siu-An is there. And there are quite a few other people. And I think Jan worked with these groups of people, and Brian worked with them to get them interested. Initially, I found that it was very much the young people who got interested. But later on, we start to have some of the more senior people, which is understandable because the senior people already have well-established fields to play in. The young people have nothing to lose to look at interesting new areas. But if we just have the young people, it won't do, because they need cover, they need role models, and they need to get their tenure, first of all. So that is a key consideration. Monique and Jan were actually an excellent combination. I don't know why Holland is always involved, including John, of course. He always supports us in all the conferences. And somehow it reminds me of when Singapore first started the economic takeoff. It was also a Dutch, Dr. Winsemius, who was the new United Nations advisor who helped our first generation leaders build Singapore. So complexity had left some of the universities, great universities in the US like Caltech and so on, they went to Santa Fe. And I think with the increasing interest all around, it's time to bring it back to the university. And I think there's a lot more positive atmosphere in the university for interdisciplinary work. We have the interdisciplinary graduate school now in NTU, and more and more encouragement for interdisciplinary work. We hope to see more of the graduate students looking at interdisciplinary areas, but there are a few challenges to overcome. First of all, it's the tenure process. We have to make sure it's sufficiently friendly to people who work in between disciplines. Then what happens to the graduate students? We have the IGS, so I suppose the best way is to register them in IGS. And I think one key element that we have to do is to get a major research program going, because an institute without a major research program is not quite a research institute. And this is something that Peter Sloot, Steve Lansing, Brian Arthur, Jan Vasbinder, and so on have been working. I've been trying to help out in working with some of the government agencies to see if we can use some of these things to enhance the governance process for Singapore in the first instance, and eventually, hopefully, for if it's successful, to go elsewhere as well. And in this, I think Peter Ho's support was really indispensable, because I found even the Prime Minister talking about complexity. So he may be the only Prime Minister that talked about complexity, I'm not sure. But he mentioned that in one of his speeches, and I have the cutting. So I think the time is right, the field is set, and I think the directors will find a fertile field to grow the fruits of this, and I hope to look back in 10 years to see some great things that have come out of this. I'm trying to help out in my own little way because I'm teaching a course on graduate studies, graduate students in EEE, and I'm introducing complexity to the first year graduate students to see how's the response. I think so far has been pretty good. I see some of them here. So I think complexity has a great future here, and I look forward to seeing what happens with the new directors being in charge.
Very good. Thank you so much. And thank you for all your support over the last few years, Guaning. We wouldn't have made it without you. So thank you really very, very much for this. There's 2 or 3 people I want to mention in particular, and this risks a lot of repetition. Monique van Donsel isn't here today, but I hope she's here in spirit, and she did so much in the couple of years that we spent planning the complexity program. Also, I want to thank again and again Peter Ho, who's taken so much interest in this and has really made it possible here at NTU. And above all, Jan Vasbinder, who got complexity here from just a working plan and some documents and thoughts and intentions into a program that's been up and running and very, very capably managed for the last 3 years or so. And Sue-Ann, I won't mention you, you're not mentioned. And Karen, of course. I want to say one point only, and that was 2 or 3 years ago, there's a very, very interesting neuroscientist from Japan visiting called Atsushi Ariki. Jan has already mentioned him. He took me aside one day and he said, "I'm so glad you're starting this in Singapore." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, if we started Complexities Institute or program in Japan, it would be Japanese. If it started in China, it would be Chinese. You can start it here in Singapore, and it can apply to Japan, to China, to Indonesia, to India, to Australia, New Zealand, everywhere in between. It speaks for all of Asia, and it's not Singapore, as Freddie pointed out, is a small island, and it's not specifically Singaporean what we want to do here. We have the ambition, and I think you'll hear from the two directors very shortly, to make this visible and a leading institute Asia-wide and visible worldwide as well. I'd like to give the last word to John Holland, and this is kind of like getting blessings from the Pope here. But if John would say a word or two and sprinkle the fairy dust on this new institute. John has been involved with complexity, as I said, from way before we had any phrase for it or word for it. John was doing agent-based modeling almost unbeknownst to him before that phrase was invented, and I think it came out of one of his papers in 1991 or so. But John, would you say a few words about complexity in general and your hopes for what's happening here?
Well, the first thing, another hidden connection, and that was when I first met Peter Ho and heard about the RAHS program. It was so different from anything that I had heard of, and that it was not just something theoretical, it was actually open. You could see it on the web, you could have doctoral dissertations. That was a critical thing as far as I was concerned, and kept me very interested in this area. There's just, if you go to the website or something of that sort, you'll find that this is very different, this notion that butterflies again, you can't control these things, but you can anticipate. And you could look not at a solution, but for possible solutions. And this is, as far as I'm concerned, the very essence of complexity studies, taking this attitude and proceeding in this way. So this kept me highly interested in Singapore. It was the reason that I got continually more and more interested in what was going on. There's just nothing like this anywhere else that I know of. Also, I think, let me just mention again George Cowan, because he's perhaps the most unusual individual I've ever met. George was what they call a low badge number at Los Alamos, which means that he was there during the Manhattan Project. George was an expert in something that very few, even among physicists, know much about, called double beta decay, which is in fact the critical step in getting a chain reaction in something like a nuclear weapon. But, and this is the important thing about George, George, for instance, was one of the founders, not the founder, but one of the founders of the Santa Fe Opera. And the Santa Fe Opera is the only group outside of perhaps Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York that attracts European artists as well as the Metropolitan Opera in the United States and so on to give concerts. It's just an amazing place. George started off founding a small bank up in Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project because there was no place for anybody to cash checks. And in fact, officially, Los Alamos didn't exist. The mail address was in Santa Fe, and I hesitate to say, but many of the people that were up at Los Alamos avoided traffic tickets that way since they didn't exist. Anyhow, I could go on with other stories about George. The important thing is that George cared not at all whether anybody knew anything about it. In fact, he preferred it when other people didn't know what he was doing. And he started all of these things. The Los Alamos Bank is now the largest bank in New Mexico, by way of example. And he seemed to have a way of starting things that grew and become very important. Now, I mentioned just one other anecdote, which I guess it was during the 80th birthday. Anyhow, I have a tendency when I'm talking before an audience, I'm really hesitating. I'm holding back, but I typically try to ask questions of the audience while I'm speaking. The audiences out here typically are very polite, and if you ask a question, they typically will not answer. But Guaning, when I gave that, you broke the ice. You asked a question of me, and suddenly other people were asking questions. So, of course, that attracted me back. Okay, Brian, that's enough.
Thank you so much, John. I would like to, where, as I said earlier, and several people have said, we are transiting from the complexity program, which has been wonderfully run by Jan Vasbinder, to the Complexity Institute, and we have the two new directors here. I'd like to do two things. One is I would like to deeply thank Jan Vasbinder for all that he's done in the last 3-4 years and before, with all these hidden connections. I thank Jan, I thank Irit, I thank Jan's kitchen table as well in the Netherlands, and I thank IPL. But let's give Jan a round of applause. Without him, it would not have been possible. So Jan, you are deeply appreciated, and thank you, thank you. And we're going to leave it to you to bring up the two directors and to say a word or two about them, if you would. Thank you.
All right. There's two entrances to the podium. I think this is the easiest one for you. Let me say few words about Steve and Peter before I ask them to come on stage and talk about their ideas. They got 5 minutes each to talk. So the curriculum or their short bio you can find in the book. So there's no need for me to repeat it. So I'd rather go for the way I know them. And I know Steve longest, so I'll start with him. I know Steve from the meeting, from the conference in honor of John Holland in 2009, when he gave his talk about Bali, which I've heard since many, many times. And I think I slowly start to understand it. So there's one of the nice things about complexity is not only does it have many, the problems have many solutions, you sometimes have to hear the problem many times to know what it is. And so Steve has since been in the picture many times. Monique invited him for several workshops. We met in Arizona. We met many times here, actually. And without saying too much about it, he's a very special person. He's an anthropologist. He's a physicist. He has ideas that only become valid many years after he had them. I mean, they were valid right away, but they were people start to see that they are valid many years after he thought of them. So I think the Complexity Institute is really blessed with a person like Steve to help run the show together with the second person, Peter Sloat. Peter I know from, I think the first time I met him was sort of in passing during the conference in honor of Muriel Gann-Mann. Because one thing that happened after the conference was John, in honor of John, it became a tradition in this place to honor people for their so much birthday. Muriel Gann-Mann was 80 and there was a conference in honor of him. And Peter was there, and I think that was the first time we met. He was at that time already a visiting professor at NTU for the School for Computer Science. So he was familiar with NTU, he was familiar with Singapore. And about a year and a half later, we had a discussion in my room on the 4th floor, which I must say, Freddie's already gone, but they have really given me the best office in the university. And we had a meeting there. And it became clear that even not knowing at that time when the Institute would take off, Peter would be a great asset for the program. So I asked him to become a visiting professor. And as I said, you can read all his credentials in his bio, and if not, just look at his website. It's really impressive. He has become a key pillar for the program, so it's only natural, and it's a blessing that he has decided and agreed to come to the to lead the Complexity Institute together with Steve. Now, if I can ask you both to come on stage, and I'll give this to you first, Steve, because he's the oldest. Yeah. We won't give you a chair. You have to stand. That is, I don't know. That's because you're just starting, right?
Thank you, Jan. All right, we're running a bit late, so I'm going to skip the introduction to me. Thank you for that one, Jan. As you've gathered, Peter and I are the beneficiaries of all this work and all this excitement and all of these hopes. So there are just two of us, and I'm going to take my 2 minutes to tell you what I think we're up to. So there are two things that I think are interesting about just thinking about. This is going to be the first new Complexity Institute in Asia, right? So in a sense, that's logical because Singapore is an unusual place. It is the most interconnected node, if you like. It's a very interesting global city without a hinterland, so it makes sense that it should happen here. And it's an interesting thing from the complexity point of view about connections. You know, complexity began at the Santa Fe Institute, as you've heard. Since then, there have been many little clusters of complexity research that have come into existence in North America and in Europe. But now we may be watching something interesting happening. We're hoping that this institute will come into existence as a very interconnected node. It already is one. You're all here. And if we can maintain that, then something interesting we can imagine speculatively that something interesting could happen. Because when little clusters begin to connect, then things happen. Occasionally you get to a critical transition point. The correlation lengths can become diverse, and phase transitions can happen, as Ricard Soleil is going to tell you. So if we can maintain this status, if the two of us, in connection with the rest of you, can get this thing going, then something interesting could happen that we cannot anticipate now. So that's my hope. That's Peter's hope as well, I think. The second reason I think it's interesting is that we are in a very interesting place. My friend David Carden has just joined us. He stepped down as the American ambassador to ASEAN in December, I think, David. He's the first American ambassador, perhaps the first of all ambassadors, to request and acquire a permanent science advisor. He's been working with ASEAN on the problems of the region. So they include, I needn't list them except to say, Indonesia has become the third largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the world recently as a result of the burning of the rainforests. And the haze from those fires are damaging to the health of the people of Singapore. I know that David was just telling me the other night that he's been working with ASEAN on the question of the collapse of the fish stocks in the South China Sea, which are estimated to be about 5 to 6% of the levels of the 1960s. We're just above the Coral Triangle here. We are in the middle. We are really at the epicenter of the greatest terrestrial and marine, for that matter, biodiversity on the planet. So all that is happening here. And all those, to understand those things, we need to know something not only about social science, but about coupled human and natural systems. So we overflow with problems and questions. And Peter and I are thinking now, this is just at the very beginning, but we're thinking perhaps one umbrella to describe where we might begin to go with this institute is the question of critical transitions, because there's some good work now on nonlinear dynamics of critical transitions, and Lord knows that's what we see in the region. So I'll say those are the two challenges that I see right immediately before us, and I think I'll just end with that if this conference ends and it's just me and Peter, then we're going to have a hard time. But if we can maintain this kind of enthusiasm, then something interesting could happen. So thank you very much, and thank you guys for making this happen.
So I actually made some notes that I'm going to read to you. So it was in the beginning of the 90s of the previous century where after I did my PhD in biophysics, I got interested in the emergence of growth and form of things that we see all around us in nature. And in many, many natural systems, and also man-made systems, if you like. And that was the beginning of a journey that took me from modeling stony corals in the Great Barrier Reef to computer simulations of necrotic tumors and tumor cores in nephroblastoma, and models of critical sizes of densely populated areas in Bangalore, in the slums there. And it took me quite some years of working in various places around the world to discover that if the answer to life, the universe, and everything is 42, I would still be interested to learn how to ask the right questions that might actually lead to that answer. And for me, the real game changer happened when I was invited by Melanie Mitchell and Jim Crutchfield to spend some time in the already mentioned many times famous institute in Santa Fe, in New Mexico. An amazing place where you can find yourself in discussion with a biologist who explains to an economist what the Schwarzschild radius is, and where they finally wander off together to debate the singularities in Einstein's equations. I thought, that is really a place to be. And that's the spirit. And I think that kind of spirit is what Steve and I want to have here. A spirit where actually disciplinarity basically completely disappears. So, as you can imagine, I'm tremendously looking forward in setting up a research institute here with Steve and others, where nobody will ask what discipline you are from, where the only thing that really counts is the problem you're trying to solve, where physics meets social science, where ideas from ecology penetrate solutions of urban challenges, where the concepts of Darwinian evolution drives the search for a healthy society, or where information theory might provide a means of really understanding what a complex systems actually is. It is a sign of real love for science and society that the board of NTU, Bertel Anderson, Professor Freddie Boy, decided to transfer the complexity program into a true complexity research institute. For me and for all of us, I guess, these are exciting times, and I'm absolutely proud and honored to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter.
Okay, thank you very much. Now there's one thing, I forgot to do one thing, and now we're going to do something else. Because a lounge somehow is something that you have to celebrate with champagne. We're not going to pop the bottle, that's going to be done outside, but if Peter Ho would come on stage and the two new directors would come on stage, and then the 7 of us, if Freddie's already left, we'll drink a glass of champagne. Monday morning is an excellent time to drink champagne. To the success of the institute,
Jan, isn't it traditional to break the bottle over the heads of the new directors?
Yeah, but then we would have to find new directors. So we're not going to do this. And then I forgot one thing, and that was actually to thank Peter Ho for his talk, and I also did not thank Freddie for his talk, but we have a little present for Peter that I'd like to give him, and then at the same time, if the photographers would take the opportunity to take all the photos they can. After we've done all that, there's coffee for the outside for everybody. You won't get champagne, and then we'll just get on with the conference. After the coffee break, there will be Dawn Farmer, and now we'll go for the champagne. Please come in. Yeah, you can do that. You can do that. All right. So, I don't know who's going to say it.
I will.
All together.
Peter will say.
One last time, a toast to Jan Vasbinder and all that he's done here. And here's to the new directors. Godspeed. Thank you very much. And for those of you who haven't got champagne, there's coffee.